everyone to this additional people committee that is in particular here so that we can consider the people strategy and the strategic workforce plan prior to our more formal meeting in due course. So thank you everyone for making the time and being able to come today for this and come prepared today. Karen, do we have any apologies?
No, all board members are in attendance.
Grand, thank you. Any declarations of interest or connections? No. So in accordance to our standing orders, we need to make a decision to take business in private, and it's being suggested that item 2.2 is taken in private. And that's because they're still draft, haven't been presented yet. Are people content? Okay, excellent. So in which case, we'll move on to the closure report of the Strategic Workforce Plan and HMICS recommendations. And we thought it was important that we managed to have a look at this report so that we could see in context as we go forwards our SWP and people strategy. So Katie, is that with you?
It is indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
So if I just take us back, initially, Police Scotland produced a strategic workforce plan in January 2021. And the methodology that was adopted at that time was a bottom-up build to get to a point of a plan. That bottom-up build identified an investment ask of 55.4 million within that version of the SWP. Subsequently, HMICS did an assurance review of the SWP, and that was presented to People Committee in August of 2022. I think what we'll recognise later in the agenda as we start to talk to the refreshed plan of the SWP is that as we've worked through that, we have taken into account the HMICS recommendations that you see before you in the report. In addition to which, the point when we started to consider the revised SWP, we did engage with HMICS directly, both in terms of the recommendations, but also around our proposed approach to this refreshed plan. So they have been engaged around the methodology. We have also been very cognizant of the recommendations that they've made, and where possible have incorporated them into the refreshed plan, or at least into our thinking as to what next iterations of that plan might look like. So I can close on that, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Katie, thank you very much indeed. That's helpful and the paper was clear. Any questions from board members? People content with that? Okay, I have a couple of questions. Katie, the HMICS report talked about moving away from a number of warranted officers, but yet we have contained that within it. So I would be helpful to understand where our commitment lies with that and what steps we would take in the future to look at morphing a workforce into the workforce that we need, rather than necessarily be shoehorned into numbers of categories of employees or the workforce in a way that might not be helpful.
Thank you, Chair. I think I understand your question. If I'm not answering correctly, please just steer me in the right direction. I think particularly with regards to warranted officers, we have a commitment which is around 16,600. And in addition to that, there's obviously a commitment around the budget allocation for staff across Police Scotland. We know from projected budget at the moment that we have a projected gap of around £18 million on our budget, but that's across the entire workforce. So as we've started to think about the next iteration of the strategic workforce plan, there's some fundamental points that we've tried to address in that plan in terms of the implementation of it, which are around things such as warranted and non-warranted. And as an organisation, how do we start to be clear on the services that need to be delivered and what's the profile of staff that's actually required, and then how do we move to that? I think that more broadly, as an organisation, our budget position does obviously pose significant challenges for us. And I think that really is sharpening our focus around where resources need to be placed against commitments that have been made. So I think if your question is around warranted and non-warranted, there is still work to be done. Part of the pressure that we have on that is that if officers are moved out of particular roles, we cannot grow staff numbers to backfill those. So therefore, for me, actually, this becomes around how do we work with trade unions, staff associations and colleagues to look at where roles might be diminishing or where we've got growth in roles, and what's the plan to be able to transition staff into those roles. So I think one of the first points of the refresh of the SWP is the fact that we have a budget envelope that we need to be able to deliver within, and therefore kind of what are the fundamental steps that we can put in place to do that. Apologies, Chair, I've not answered your question.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much, Katie. Tom?
Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Katie. That's really helpful, and it's realistic in its approach as well. I totally understand that. I mean, we are where we are with the envelope we have, but a strategic workforce plan is also about our ambition as well, and we just have to be clear about delivery on it. The sort of questions I've got around workforce flexibility. How do we build that into the plan? How do we build the workforce mix? I mean, there's areas there in recent discussions around, falling numbers of special constabulary, for instance, but that's a very valuable resource for us and things like that. So those areas that are maybe out with the box of what we traditionally recognise and identify, but getting us into a position in the workforce for the future. How do we start to bring that into the plan in future iterations, or indeed in this one?
Thank you, Tom. I think in the plan, as we kind of get onto the agenda item to actually discuss the refresh plan, I think we've been really clear, or at least I've been clear in terms of the few months that I've been with the organisation, that there's a level of maturity around strategic workforce planning. And in one part of the refreshed plan, we do actually talk to kind of 3 steps in relation to that and where we think we're at. So there's a kind of practical bit around strategic workforce planning, then getting into collaborative workforce planning, where it begins to be integrated into the kind of total systems approach of organisations, and then transformative. And actually, I think in terms of Police Scotland, we are somewhere between tactical and collaborative. So we've been really clear in the revised SWP that this has to be an iterative paper. So this is not about us now. We've delivered an SWP that takes us from 24 to 27. This has to be, we keep on coming back to People Committee and Board to show how we are moving this forward. So we continue to build on that degree of ambition that you point to there. I think that there are some aspects of SWP, as I'm sure board member or committee members will start to challenge, where, for example, assessment of future needs, scenario-based planning, the future focus, we're still quite light on, and we recognise that in this revised vision. However, over the course of the next kind of 12 to 18 months, you should fully expect us to grow in our maturity around those around that kind of journey.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you. I've got one more question, and then the problem we have, of course, we have 2 Davids, but I'll then bring David Malcolm and David Zergold in if they wish to make a comment on this. In your paper, Katie, you talk about a number of things which we can then cover later on in the meeting, but you talk about shift patterns and changes to shift patterns and assessment of whether they're meeting resilience demands and obviously causing less complexity for individual members of staff when they have to work overtime. In the assessment of the shift pattern, can you help me understand what part of health and well-being of the workforce, so what evidence and research that is there demonstrating the negative impact of shift working on staff, and clearly almost all of our staff have to work shifts, but how do we make sure we're minimising the negative health impact by working shifts, and is that being taken into account when we're considering different shift patterns?
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to bring Peter Blair in a second in relation to this, as he's much closer to the kind of the operations of the shift patterns. I think there's no doubt, particularly as we start to get into the people strategy and the whole strategic theme around well-being of our workforce, there is no doubt that that comes into play. It's complex because it's not just about setting shift patterns, it's also other matters such as cancelled annual leave, RRRDs, etc. And actually, when you start to look at some of that, and certainly the Federation, I'm sure we'll talk to this, you start to get into matters around custody, around courts, around health provision, etc. So shift patterns is just one element for us where actually we need to look at the total availability of our workforce. Because actually what we'll see when we start to look at workforce numbers and we report on it, when you actually then look at, whether there is re-rostered rest days, annual leave, sickness absence, etc., that availability of the workforce actually is one of the most telling things around the impact on well-being of our colleagues. And that's both for colleagues within areas such as C3, which I'm sure David Malcolm will talk about, but also for our officers on the front line. I don't know, Peter, if there's specifics that you want to talk to in relation to work that's being done around the shift patterns.
Yeah, we have quite a robust system already in place around about shift patterns. Obviously, the framework that we use is the workforce agreement. So there's a workforce agreement in place for all officers, which sets out the structure about which we work within in terms of the shift patterns. So it's kind of the schematic which we work to. But for any new shift pattern, we do a fatigue index to make sure that the officers aren't going to feel more fatigued, particularly as a result of it. They are all fully consulted, obviously, with our colleagues in the Federation who sit on the Working Practices Review Board, which reviews all shift patterns before they go live, and they're fully reviewed after that. So as far as we're concerned, organisationally, there is already quite a robust process in place to ensure that the shift patterns that we agree to with our Federation colleagues and with our workforce are both appropriate and good for the well-being, or as good as they can be in terms of well-being. The two shift patterns that are the most prevalent are variable shift arrangements. One's a 1-4-7 and one's a treble 2. The treble 2 is kind of 2 earlies, 2 lates, 2 nights, 4 days off, and that works through. So that's there's about 20% of the organisation works that, and there's about 20% works the 1-4-6, which is a slightly different shift pattern. But that's the kind of two main ones that we're currently working as it stands just now. Thanks, Chair.
So my question is, what consideration has been given to the evidence and the research on the health impact of shift patterns to developing a shift patterns? And it may be that I'm content to have this as an offline conversation or later on in the agenda, because I also recognise sometimes people's personal preferences for the shift patterns are not healthy, but it suits their own current arrangements. So I'm wondering if we could maybe just note that in the minute and either maybe just have a briefing paper on the evidence and research on health impacts. So that's great. Thank you very much, both.
I'll do that, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. David Malcolm, any comments that you might want to have on this?
Thanks very much, Chair. Just wanted to say that we have had quite a lot of engagement with Katie and her team in designing and working towards the strategic workforce plan and responding to recommendations. It's been very welcome, and the engagement has been positive, and we've helped shape a lot of that. So a lot of the things that we would raise and look to address have been done so through those forums to get us to this actual point. So it's positive steps towards that. I think there was myself was perhaps leaning a bit towards the sort of negative sphere of, oh, here we go again when we started work on it again. But I think Katie has had a good strategic oversight of this and getting us to a place and helping us understand what we need from it. So I think in whole we're having a positive experience up to this point with this.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. And we can have more than that in the private session on any particular issue. David Threadgold, anything on the closure report for the SWP?
Thank you, Chair. Just to echo what Peter said there about the shift patterns, we are really engaged in, any, process that involves that, and also, more individually about flexible working applications. There are really robust processes in place before these things are agreed, and the health of the officer affected is really at the forefront of those considerations. My observation, and this will be something I think for those who have been in service for a long time that has gone round and round, is around about the operational base levels and how important it is that we have a mechanism or a structure that is in place that accurately identifies the demand that we have in various areas across Scotland. I know that work has been ongoing in that area, but for me, this is the bottom of the pyramid that all of this sits on, because at the moment, I think we perhaps have a situation where it's probably too general to say that we're working either on historical best guesses or slightly less historical best guesses to address the demand and identify officers that are required for a particular policing area. And the impact of those base levels on requests for time off are really significant, because we struggle across the board to reach that base level, and the key word there is base. And I think when we finally get that work done, that should have a really positive impact on everything that we're talking about here. Thank you.
That's really, really helpful and important. And we've got quite a lot of data around in terms of the workforce and productivity, or the productivity and demand unit. So it's good to see that work in progress and understanding the importance, the impact on the workforce. If I have no other questions from board members, then I think we've discussed this, we've noted it, and that will then come to the end of our public session, and we'll move on into our private session.